Joseph James D'Angelo, born in 1945 to a military family, appeared to be a model citizen for a long time. He served in Vietnam, studied criminal justice, and worked as a police officer. On the outside, he was a responsible man, husband, and father. But behind this mask lurked one of the most violent serial killers in U.S. history. As a child, he experienced violence and witnessed tragic events that left a mark on his psyche. His tendency toward aggression manifested itself as early as adolescence through theft and cruelty to animals. His series of crimes began in Visalia with more than 100 thefts and 1 murder, and soon escalated to rape and murder throughout California. He would break into homes at night, tie up and intimidate his victims, sometimes torturing them for hours. D'Angelo combined cold calculation and sadistic tendencies in his actions. He stalked his future victims, called them in advance, and left obscene messages. His particular cruelty was evident in his attacks on couples, where he humiliated men and raped women, intensifying the atmosphere of terror. The police tried to catch him for decades. Dozens of departments worked together on the case, but to no avail. It was only with the development of DNA technology in 2001 that the rapist from the East Side and the night killer were linked to the same person. Later, genetic genealogy led investigators to D'Angelo, and he was arrested in 2018. The evidence included secretly collected samples of his DNA, which matched biological traces from the crime scenes. The trial was historic. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, but as part of a plea bargain, he pleaded guilty to 13 murders and dozens of other crimes. In 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. D'Angelo's story became an example of how technology can bring justice decades later. His cases changed the approach to investigations and accelerated the development of DNA databases. And society will forever remember the horrors that can be hidden in the everyday life of the perfect neighbor. William George Bonin, born in 1947, was a serial killer and sexual predator known as the Freeway Killer. At the time of his arrest, he had a complex criminal record for sex crimes and had been treated in psychiatric institutions on numerous occasions. Between 1979 and 1980, he was found guilty of at least 14 murders, and he himself later confessed to 21. Outwardly, he was a man with a complicated biography, but in reality, he was a cold-blooded sadist who operated from a van, where he held, raped, and tortured his victims. Factors that led to the violence included early traumatic experiences in the family, systemic failures in rehabilitation, and military service. Psychiatrists noted Bonin's tendency towards sadism, antisocial disorder, and need for control. After previous arrests and treatment, he was released, which created institutional vulnerability. Probation and supervision did not prevent the escalation of criminal activity. The series of murders itself followed a pattern, luring hitchhikers and teenagers into a van under the pretext of sex or work, tying them up and torturing them with sophisticated methods using improvised tools, then strangling them and dumping their bodies on highways. Accomplices were often involved in the crimes. The victims were predominantly young boys and young men. Law enforcement agencies combined the efforts of the counties, compared fibers and biological traces found in the van, and obtained testimony from accomplices. The arrest and the evidence found allowed for numerous charges to be brought. Bonin's confessions accelerated the investigation. The trial revealed the weight of the evidence and conflicting interpretations of the motives, ranging from deep childhood trauma to deliberate sadism. The jury returned a death sentence,
which was carried out in 1996 by lethal injection. Bonin's case became a painful lesson about the shortcomings of supervising dangerous repeat offenders and the need for coordinated work between the police and social services, while the victims' families were left with lasting trauma and a demand for justice. Randy Stephen Kraft, born in Long Beach in 1945, showed great intelligence and leadership skills from an early age. He grew up in a strict family environment, and his early successes at school and involvement in politics created an image of a determined young man. However, behind this outward prosperity lay an inner duality, an awareness of his own homosexuality, attempts to hide it, and a rift between social expectations and personal identity. In adulthood, Kraft began to lead a double life. On the one hand, a respectable employee and partner. On the other, a sadistic killer. His series of crimes began in the early 1970s and continued for more than a decade. His victims were young men and teenagers whom he picked up in his car and plied with alcohol and tranquilizers. This was followed by torture, sexual assault, and murder, most often by strangulation or beating. Many bodies were found near highways, and particular cruelty was evident in the mutilation and abuse of the victims. A characteristic piece of evidence was the evaluation card, a list of 61 encrypted entries containing the names and characteristics of his victims. Investigators spent decades comparing evidence. Photographs of naked and lifeless bodies found in Kraft's car, the personal belongings of the victims, and similarities in the methods of murder became the key to solving the case. His arrest happened by chance in 1983, when a patrol car stopped his vehicle for drunk driving and found the body of Marine Terry Gambrell inside. The trial, which began in 1988, lasted more than a year and became one of the most expensive in Orange County history. The prosecution presented hundreds of pieces of evidence and dozens of witness testimonies. The defense tried to dispute Kraft's connection to the murders, pointing to other serial killers who were active at the same time. However, the jury found him guilty of 16 murders, and the judge handed down a death sentence. Kraft remains on death row, denying his guilt. His case became a grim symbol of the era of highway killers in California, and showed how difficult it is to investigate crimes that span time and space. Society learned a lesson about the need for interagency cooperation, and the memory of the victims remains a painful reminder of the limits of human cruelty. Charles Manson, born in 1934, grew up in difficult circumstances. His mother was an alcoholic, his father unknown, and his early years were spent in poverty, prison visits, and humiliation. As a teenager, he began stealing and was sent to reform schools, where he was subjected to violence. He spent most of his youth in prison, learning to manipulate people and hide his own aggression. By the age of 30, he had experience as a pimp, petty crook, and convict. But it was in the 1960s that he found a new role for himself, that of a charismatic guru among hippies. Gathering a group of marginalized young people around him, Manson created the so-called family, where he preached a mixture of ideas about love, apocalyptic prophecies, and racial war. He presented himself as the chosen one, hinted at his similarity to Christ, and assured his disciples that he was preparing them for the coming cataclysm. Under the influence of drugs and his charisma, young people became submissive and ready to carry out any order. In the summer of 1969, Manson instructed his followers to commit a series of murders. On the night of August 9th, they broke into a house on Cielo Drive and killed 5 people, including pregnant actress Sharon Tate. The next day, the La Bianca couple became victims.
These brutal crimes shocked America. Panic swept through Los Angeles, and the word helter-skelter became a symbol of chaos and violence. The investigation tracked down the family after one of its members confessed. Linda Kasabian's testimony and evidence led to the arrest of Manson and his followers. At the trial, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi presented them as a religious sect ready to unleash a race war. The jury found Manson and his followers guilty and initially sentenced them to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment. Manson's story became a lesson in how charisma and manipulation can turn vulnerable people into instruments of violence. This trial changed the perception of cults and sects in the United States, and Manson's image became a symbol of the dark side of the 1960s counterculture. Richard Ramirez, born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, grew up in a family with an abusive father and an unstable atmosphere. As a child, he suffered brain damage and epilepsy, and by the age of 10, he had started using drugs. His cousin, a Vietnam veteran who showed him photographs of atrocities and murders, had a significant influence on him. Ramirez witnessed his cousin shoot his wife, which permanently distorted his perception of violence. As a teenager, he became addicted to LSD, became interested in Satanism, and began to combine sexual fantasies with cruelty. After moving to California in the early 1980s, he began to support his drug addiction by burglary. From April 1984 to August 1985, his crimes turned into a series of attacks and murders. He would break into houses at night, kill, rape, and torture his victims with electric shocks, machetes, or knives. He was unpredictable. His victims included both elderly couples and children. Humiliation and sadism were an integral part of his attacks, which caused particular horror among the survivors. The investigation was extensive. The police compared ballistics, shoe prints, and fingerprints. The breakthrough came when Ramirez's fingerprint was found in a stolen car. His face was published in the press, and on August 31st, 1985, Los Angeles residents recognized and detained him themselves, beating him until the police arrived. The trial began in 1988. At the very first hearing, he raised his hand with a pentagram drawn on it and shouted, "Hail Satan." In 1989, he was found guilty of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The judge called his actions evil beyond human comprehension and sentenced him to death. Ramirez never repented. His charisma attracted female admirers, and he even got married in prison. However, he was never executed. In 2013, he died of lymphoma in San Quentin prison. His story is an example of how childhood trauma, drugs, and a cult of violence can give rise to one of the most terrifying figures in U.S. criminal history. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born in 1948 in California into a family with serious conflicts. From an early age, he showed cruelty to animals and played strange games involving death. His parents' divorce and his particularly domineering and humiliating mother reinforced his alienation. Kemper began to demonstrate frightening fantasies at an early age and killed his grandmother and grandfather at the age of 15. After staying in a psychiatric clinic, he managed to convince doctors of his normality and was released. Retaining a deep hatred for his mother and suppressed sadistic desires, his series of murders began in 1972. He picked up female students hitchhiking in the Santa Cruz area, took them to secluded places, where he killed them and committed necrophilic acts. The bodies were then dismembered, and the heads were often kept as trophies. 6 young women and 1 schoolgirl became his victims.
Kemper himself admitted that each victim became a surrogate mother. In April 1973, he achieved his ultimate goal. He killed his mother, Clarnell, and her friend, then called the police and voluntarily surrendered. Investigators were struck by his calm confessions and detailed descriptions. He cooperated, showed them where he had disposed of the bodies, and explained his motives, linking them to his hatred of his mother. The arrest put an end to the panic among California students, who had been terrorized by reports of a hitchhiking maniac. At his trial in 1973, the defense tried to prove insanity, but psychiatrists found him fully aware of his actions. Kemper demanded the death penalty, but under the moratorium, he received 8 life sentences. Kemper's case became pivotal in criminal psychology. It was his interviews that helped the FBI develop methods for profiling serial killers.
His story showed how a combination of mental disorders, childhood trauma, and systemic errors can give rise to a monstrous figure, whose crimes became a symbol of cold calculation and deep inner hatred. Raydell Sims, born in Oklahoma in 1935, showed a propensity for violence from a young age. He committed his first serious crime in 1965 when he raped a 70-year-old woman during a robbery. After his imprisonment, he moved to Fresno, got married, became a father, and found work as a cook. Outwardly, Sims appeared to be a normal family man, but at home he was sadistic. His wife recalled that he humiliated and choked her during intimate moments. In the mid-1970s, Fresno was rocked by a series of brutal murders. Girls and young women disappeared and were later found strangled and raped. The first victims were Kathy Stark and Elizabeth Ortega, acquaintances of the Sims family. In 1975 and 1976, Robin McCallum and Eva Hernandez Lucio were killed. All of them lived near Sims, and the method of the murders pointed to the same perpetrator. The culmination was the death of 17-year-old Janet Hirschtain in 1977. The investigation led the police to a man who called himself David McGowan, who turned out to be Ray Sims himself. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. For many years, Sims was believed to be responsible for only one murder, but advances in DNA testing changed the course of the case. In 1996, blood samples were taken from him, and in 2001, analysis showed a match with evidence found on the bodies of other victims. This confirmed that Sims was a serial killer. In 2008, he was found guilty of Ortega's murder and sentenced to a second life term. The death penalty was not applied due to a national moratorium in the 1970s. The remaining charges were dropped, as he no longer had any chance of release. Sims' story became an example of how technology can solve old cases and prove a criminal's guilt decades later. For the residents of Fresno, his name will forever remain a symbol of the fear that reigned in the city in the 1970s. Cleof Prince Jr. was born in 1967 and served in the U.S. Navy in his youth, where he was court-martialed for theft in 1989. After a short sentence, he was released and soon moved to the Buena Vista Gardens housing complex in San Diego. Outwardly, he looked like an ordinary young man, but in 1990, he revealed himself to be one of California's most brutal serial killers. From January to September of that year, he committed 6 murders that went down in history as the Claremont murders. All of his victims were young women who were at home during the day. Prince entered through unlocked doors and windows, attacked them as they were getting ready to take a shower, raped them, and stabbed them to death with kitchen knives. He stole jewelry from his victims, wearing some of it himself or giving it to his girlfriend, turning the murders into a trophy hunt. Among the victims were college students, residents of neighboring complexes, and a mother and daughter who were killed on the same day. The police created a composite sketch based on an eyewitness description and conducted the largest manhunt in San Diego history. In February 1991, Prince was caught after attempting to break into a house. He was identified by neighbors, and later DNA analysis confirmed his connection to the murders. The investigation established that he had stalked some of his victims after visiting a sports club. The trial began in 1992. The prosecution presented evidence: DNA, eyewitness testimony, and stolen rings. In July 1993, the jury found him guilty of 6 murders and more than 20 other serious crimes. In November of that year, he was sentenced to death. Today, Cleof Prince remains on death row at San Quentin Prison. His cases demonstrated the power of DNA evidence and served as a warning about how an unlocked door can lead to tragedy. Society saw that even in everyday life, there could be a predator capable of destroying families and causing a wave of fear throughout an entire city. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi, born in 1951 in Rochester, New York, showed signs of psychological problems from an early age: seizures, bedwetting, aggression, and pathological lying. His childhood was marred by constant visits to doctors and difficulties at school. After the death of his adoptive father, he became withdrawn, but as a teenager he began to exhibit sexual deviations. His attempts to get an education and join the police force failed, and his life gradually descended into crime, petty theft, fraud, and working as a security guard, where he stole jewelry to impress women. In 1976, Bianchi moved to Los Angeles and became close to his cousin, Angelo Buono. Their joint activities began with pimping, but soon turned into a series of kidnappings and murders. From October 1977 to February 1978, posing as police officers, they kidnapped girls and women, took them to Buono's workshop, where they raped, tortured, and strangled them. A total of 10 people fell victim to them in Los Angeles. Their methods of murder included strangulation, electric shock, and even chemical experiments. Panic gripped the community. The unknown hillside strangler paralyzed the city. After moving to Washington, Bianchi attempted to act independently. In January 1979, he killed 2 female students, but left behind a lot of evidence and was quickly arrested. During interrogations, he tried to feign a split personality, introducing Steve Walker and Billy, but experts proved his deception. In the end, he pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Buono. The trial became a media sensation. Bianchi was described as a manipulator and a sadist. He escaped the death penalty, receiving 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole. He subsequently made several attempts to be released, but was denied each time, most recently in 2025. The story of Bianchi and Buono became a symbol of the brutality of the 1970s, and a lesson in how charisma and manipulation can hide monstrous cruelty. Their case influenced the development of criminal psychology and methods of investigating serial murders. The Hillside Stranglers is the nickname given by the media to criminals who terrorized Los Angeles from October 1977 to February 1978. Initially, it was believed that there was a single serial killer, but it later became clear that the cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono were behind the series of murders. Their victims were 10 girls and women aged 12 to 28, whom they lured by pretending to be police officers. The crimes were particularly brutal. The victims were kidnapped and taken to Buono's workshop in Glendale, where they were sexually assaulted, tortured, and strangled. After that, the bodies were thoroughly cleaned and dumped in the hills around the city, which gave rise to the name of the case. At first, street sex workers were killed, But later, the victims were girls from middle-class families, which caused real panic. Women were afraid to go out at night, and newspapers published warnings daily. The investigation yielded no results for a long time. The police had no evidence other than signs of strangulation and identical murder methods. The situation only changed in 1979, when Bianchi was arrested in Washington for the murder of 2 students. His carelessness left a lot of evidence, and investigators linked him to the series of murders in Los Angeles. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Buono. Buono's trial in 1983 became one of the most high-profile in California history. Despite Bianchi's attempts to feign a split personality, both criminals were found guilty. Bianchi received a life sentence, and Buono was sentenced to life without parole. This case became an example of how 2 seemingly ordinary men were able to paralyze an entire city by exploiting the trust in the police and the defenselessness of their victims.
It also demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation and psychological expertise, becoming one of the key pages in the history of American criminology.
Lauren Herzog and Wesley Sherman, known as the Speed Freak Killers, grew up in the small California town of Linden. Childhood friends, they shared a passion for hunting and fishing, and as adults, they became addicted to methamphetamine. Herzog was more withdrawn and dependent on others, while Shermanstein had an aggressive, quick-tempered personality. Together, they turned their friendship into an alliance based on drugs, violence, and cruelty. Their crimes began in the mid-1980s and continued for more than a decade. The men went on so-called hunts, killing random passers-by for fun. Their victims were men and women, teenagers and adults, who were shot, raped, or stabbed to death. The bodies were dumped in mines, abandoned wells, and ravines. One of the first known victims was Cheryl Wheeler, a schoolgirl who disappeared after meeting Shermanstein. Later, Cindy Vanderheiden disappeared, whose remains were found in a well years later. Characteristically, both killers denied their own guilt, shifting responsibility onto each other. The investigation began in the late 1990s when the blood of one of the victims was found in Shermanstein's car. Soon, both were arrested. During interrogation, Herzog partially confessed and revealed details that coincided with the investigation's findings. In 2001, Sherman was sentenced to death, and Herzog was sentenced to 78 years in prison. Herzog's sentence was later reduced to 14 years due to violations during the interrogations. His release sparked protests from the families of the victims, and in 2012, he committed suicide after learning that Shermanstein was revealing the location of the bodies. The trial against Shermanstein was accompanied by dozens of testimonies from women who had survived his violence. The prosecution described him as a ruthless sadist, while the defense attempted to challenge the reliability of Herzog's confessions. Nevertheless, the sentence remained in force, and Sherman is still on death row in San Quentin. This case exposed the weaknesses of the system. The late discovery of human remains and evidence of dozens of possible victims never led to the full disclosure of all the episodes. For society, the story became a symbol of how drug addiction and impunity can breed monsters. And for the families of the missing, a constant reminder of their loss and the injustice they suffered.
Roger Reese Kibbe, better known as the I-5 Strangler, was born in 1939 and led what appeared to be a normal life, working as a parachute technician. However, behind this mask lurked one of California's most brutal serial killers. His propensity for violence manifested itself as early as the 1980s. He preyed mainly on women who were giving rides to hitchhikers or who happened to be near the highway, which made his crimes unpredictable and particularly dangerous to the community. The first known victim was Lou Ellen Burley, who disappeared in 1977 on her way to a job interview. Over the years, Kibble honed his signature. He tied women up with parachute cord, taped their mouths shut, and cut their clothes with scissors, leaving jagged, recognizable marks. After sexually assaulting his victims, he would strangle them and sometimes cut off their hair to hide the traces of tape. His arrest in 1987 happened by chance when a victim screamed and a police officer happened to be nearby. This episode marked the beginning of the end for Kibbe. The investigation into the murders lasted for decades. In 1988, he was convicted of the murder of Darcy Frackenpole, and in 2009, to avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to 6 more murders and received 6 life sentences. It was not until 2011 that DNA confirmed that one of his victims was Lou Ellen Burley. For the families of the victims, this brought some closure to a terrible story. Kibbe died in 2021 in Mole Creek Prison. He was strangled by his cellmate Jason Badrow, a self-proclaimed Satanist who motivated the murder as revenge for all women. Badrow received another life sentence. Kibbe's story became a symbol of how difficult it is to identify a normal person who is capable of committing a series of brutal murders. His crime served as a reminder of the risks associated with the vulnerability of women on the roads, as well as the fact that even decades later, justice can catch up with a murderer.
Joseph Nasso, known as Mad Joe, was born in 1934 in Rochester, New York, and for many years appeared to be an unremarkable man. A U.S. Air Force veteran, amateur photographer, and petty thief, he led a solitary life, living at various times in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Reno. His strange behavior and dark hobby, photographing women in degrading poses, created an image of an eccentric but secretive man. Behind his ordinary exterior lurked a serial killer and rapist. His crimes spanned decades. The first murders date back to the mid-1970s, when young women such as Roxy Ashby and Carmen Colon were strangled. In the 1990s, he continued his attacks, killing Pamela Parsons and Tracy Tafoya. A characteristic feature of Nasso was that he chose victims with the same initials, which gave rise to a theory of a connection with the so-called alphabet murders in Rochester, although no evidence of this was found. Nasso tied up the women, strangled them, and then photographed them, using mannequin parts for staging. These grim sessions became his signature. For a long time, investigators were unable to gather sufficient evidence. The breakthrough came in 2010 when a rape diary was found during a search of his home, in which he listed the women and locations associated with his crimes. At his trial in 2013, prosecutors presented photographs and records that confirmed the horrific nature of his actions. The jury found him guilty of 4 murders. Nasso was sentenced to death in California, but the execution was not carried out due to a moratorium. He remains a symbol of how a man with an unremarkable appearance can hide monstrous crimes for decades. The Nasso case reminded society of the importance of carefully investigating old cases and the vulnerability of women, especially those on the margins of society.
Samuel Little, born on June 7, 1940, in Georgia, grew up in a dysfunctional family. His mother was a teenage prostitute, and he was raised mainly by his grandmother. From an early age, he showed a tendency toward deviance, committing petty thefts, and later ended up in a juvenile detention center. As a teenager, he fantasized about strangling women, an obsession that became the key to his future crimes. Little's adult life consisted of endless arrests in various U.S. states, from theft and assault to rape. However, for a long time he avoided serious punishment. Little committed his first murder, according to him, in the early 1970s. He chose women from vulnerable segments of society: sex workers, drug addicts, homeless people. His method was always the same: strangulation with his bare hands. He considered this method clean, leaving no traces. Almost all of the murders took place in deserted areas, on highways and motels, on the outskirts of cities.
He often lured his victims with offers of a ride or drugs. Little took particular pleasure in controlling life and death, which he later admitted during interrogations. Despite numerous suspicions, there was a long lack of evidence. In 1984, he was convicted of assault, but served only 2.5 years and soon resumed killing. The bodies of dozens of women were found across the country, but the police did not connect the cases. It was not until 2012 that he was arrested in Kentucky for drug possession, and DNA analysis linked him to 3 murders in Los Angeles. This marked the beginning of the largest investigation in FBI history. In 2014, Little was found guilty of 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. In the following years, he began cooperating with investigators, confessing to dozens of new murders. He described his victims and the locations in detail, and even created portraits of the women from memory.
As a result, the FBI confirmed his involvement in at least 60 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in the United States. Samuel Little's story revealed weaknesses in the American justice system. Bias against victims from marginalized segments of society allowed him to hide for decades. His cases served as a reminder of the importance of paying attention to the disappearance of women who are easy to overlook. Even after Little's death in 2020, the work to identify his victims continues, and his confessions remain an important source for solving old crimes.
Anthony John Sully was born on January 6, 1944, in San Francisco and grew up in Millbrae. After school, he married and joined the police force, where he served from 1966 to 1974. Early in his career, his colleagues considered him a reliable and conscientious officer. But in his personal life, he was violent. Both of his wives divorced him because of abuse, and in one case, the court issued a restraining order. After leaving the police force, Sally went into private business and rented a warehouse in Burlingame. By the early 1980s, he had become involved with the criminal underworld. Pimps and prostitutes, started using drugs, and invested money in an escort agency. In February 1983, Sally committed his first murder. Prostitute Gloria Frevel was brought to his warehouse, where he kept her handcuffed for several days, tortured and raped her, and eventually strangled her. Later, while transporting the body, the girl regained consciousness, and he finished her off with an axe.
A few weeks later, he killed 19-year-old Brenda Oakton by shooting her in the back of the head. In the spring, Sally lured pimp Michael Thomas and his common-law wife Phyllis Melendez into a hangar, shot them both, and hid their bodies along with Oakton's in metal barrels, which he filled with concrete and dumped in Golden Gate Park. In the summer, he called his ex-girlfriend Barbara Searcy to his place and killed her with a shot to the back of the head, then disposed of the body by dragging it away in his car. His last victim was drug dealer Catherine Barrett. Sully and an accomplice stabbed her multiple times and beat her with a sledgehammer, then dumped her body on the street. He did not commit all these crimes alone. Tina Livingston, Kelly Burns, and Michael Francis were involved in the crimes, helping to lure victims, restrain them, and dispose of the bodies. It was their testimony that later played a key role in the investigation. In August 1983, Sullivan was arrested. His fingerprints were found on the barrels containing the bodies, and numerous pieces of evidence were found in the hangars in the car. In 1986, the court found him guilty of 6 murders and sentenced him to death. In his final statement, he declared his innocence. But all appeals were rejected. His accomplices received different sentences. Livingston made a deal and got off with a minimum punishment, while Burns and Francis received life sentences. Sully himself ended up on death row at San Quentin Prison, where he spent almost 40 years. He died on September 8, 2023, of cancer at the age of 79, without ever seeing his sentence carried out. His story became an example of how a former police officer, once considered a model officer, turned into one of California's most brutal killers.